Okay, welcome back, Graphics Addict. I'm Herb, and this video is about Processor and how to use it to animate things in a GL window. Let's go ahead and include the processor.h file. And in order to create this layer, we're going to use the simplest viewer, which is the processor's viewer. And we're going to call it P5. So this is a layer. It can be called anything you want. So you could call it enemies. You could call it stars, but we're already using that word. You could call it asteroids. You could call it entities. You could call it actors. What we're going to do is call it P5. Now the P5 is now a rendering layer, and down here in the rendering clause of the GL window, you're going to type p5.render, and that will render the processors that are in the list. And in the between, you're going to call p5.between. And by doing this, you're sort of hooking it in. In the setup, you're going to call p5.go, which calls setup on anything that's been added to the P5 list at that point. If you add anything to that list later, you have to call it setup manually. And it's done for a couple of different reasons, but it's done that way. Generally, most of the time we're using setup because processors and processing are sort of, well, processing was sort of the structurally, it was a inspiration. So in order to create a custom animation or button or any interactable graphical object, we create a class that is a derived version of a processor. And we're going to create a processor object called Spaceman. And these spacemen are going to spin and drift in space. So we're going to call this this is a child of processor. And in setup, so a couple of things. We're using zero types. 0.handmade.network, you can learn more about zero types. But I'll give you a little bit of an overview as we do this. So ZP means zeroed pointer. By the way, generally everything is public. So ZP means zeroed pointer, and it's a template that allows you to create a zero pointer. So it's just a nice, neat way of creating a zeroed pointer. And we're going to create a GL image of the spaceman himself. And we're going to call him Guy. All right. Then up here, we're going to create we're going to include texture library. And this is going to allow us to load a little space guy. So if we go, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to show you around some of the data files that are given to you with the framework. If you bop into the data folder, there are a bunch of folders, and one of them is images. And there are some images in here, most of which you're allowed to use, but some of which you're not because I don't own them, or because they're simply part of Appaloon. But two folders that you absolutely can use are elements and flares. You can also use fonts, AT fonts, animations, pretty much anything. There's this, I don't think this is in the repo, but let me just delete that as well. You know, it's fine. Most of the images are from third party anyway, or I created them. But you know, some of the art, like Fringes of the Empire, is this title screen from Fringes of the Empire, and I'd rather you didn't use that. Maybe I'll remove it from the repo. But there's icons and ships and just little things in here. And one of them is this little guy, astro.png. And we're going to use this as the texture for our spaceman. So in order to load him, we're going to do library.load data images spaceman, or astro.png, I think. Is that what it was called? Yeah. And .load will load it into the library, but you also want guy to equal that because we're getting back a pointer to a GL image. And this is going to load the texture, and it's going to put it into the GPU as well. So with that being, so that's the setup for that. And down here, we've got a between, and maybe we'll do x plus equals 1, or let's do that int, let's say 3.0 times uniform minus 1.5. So it's moving similar to the stars, but then let's actually multiply that whole thing by 2. And we'll do the same thing with the y value. So now we're going to be drifting. And then we're going to do a render. And the render goes like that. And so we're going to go ahead and use stretch E, where we can use guy and crayon. So we need a tint, all right? And we're gonna need an alpha, which is 1.0. And we're gonna do transparent. See, okay, that's our blending mode. And then we're going to go x minus guy width div 2, y minus guy width div 2, and then guy height rather, and then guy width, guy height. And that will draw a little dude there. But wouldn't it be better if we had him rotating while he drifts? So in order to do that, we need to have a little Z double angle. And we're going to increase the angle by up to 1. So they don't all move at the same speed. Okay, and then in setup, we're going to set the angle to a random value between 1 and 360. Or 0 and 360. So we need a tint. So to use, so a tint, we would use crayon. Crayon tint. And we need to set it to something. So I'm going to use brights, which is a list of bright values. And I'm going to pass it a random integer up to 1024. And that will pick a bright value. All right. Good. That's fine. Now this needs to be pivoting. Pivot. Tid. Rotated. Rect D. All right. And it takes a lot of the same parameters. So the source is the guy, the tint is the tint, the blend is transparency. All right. And then the XY, so X comma Y. Then the pivot, which is 0, 0, which means the center. H2, which is half of the height. And W2, which is half of the width. Okay. And then the angle. And the final parameter is having leave texture mode. Having leave, I don't know that we need that. All right, so here we have, it should be pivoting, and it will be pivoting around at its center. So little guys will be floating around. Now we've created the animation, but we haven't added the animation to the list yet. So I think what we'll do is down here in between, we're going to add an if input left clicked. And whenever you click on the mouse, you're going to add a guy, but we'll give one guy in the very beginning. So let's firstly create the guy in the very beginning. So p5.add new spaceman. Now he'll appear in the upper left-hand corner of the screen because we haven't set his X and Y. So let's do this. Spaceman S equals new spaceman. SX equals, and then we're going to use this same equation to pick a random value on the screen, and this same equation to pick a random value on the screen for Y. And then we're going to add that to the list, and then there will be one guy floating around in the middle of the universe in the beginning. Now, whenever you left click, we're going to add another spaceman. In order to do that, we're going to do this. And instead of this being a random value, it's actually going to be input MXI and MYI. And that will mean that when we click, it's going to take that value. So I'm in debug mode now. It's usually a good idea to be in debug mode because you have at least some idea of what's gone wrong. So I'm going to build and we're going to check it out. Okay, fingers crossed that this is going to work. Ooh. Now in debug mode, it actually puts everything in a window. Oh, there he is. And there's another guy there, and I'm not sure why there's two. Unless I think it may have simulated a click when I first entered the game. I'm not sure about that. But if I click around, I should be able to create some new ones. So now, we're sort of got something that looks kind of like a game. Not really, but I mean, there's this little guy bopping around, and put another guy there. There's another guy. It's almost like a delayed reaction with this clicking. Weird. Well, I don't always use left click. There's another way to pull the mouse. So I'm going to just switch to that way, which is instead of doing left click, you just do input left. And even though that's an integer, it means the number of frames since you last clicked, or that you've held the button, rather. So this should allow us to sort of rapid fire create guys. And if you say if input left equals 1, then you would be able to limit it to just the one frame. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Now we've got our one guy. And oh my goodness, there they are. Bunch of dudes. And we can just keep doing this because it's pretty quick. By the way, the blinking of the mouse cursor is an indicator of the frames per second. So if you ever see it pulsing very slowly, you know that you've sort of maxed out the amount you can do in a single frame. But as you can see, if it's just drawing a single texture in a different color, you can do this many, many times. And it's still pretty quick, although you can see it's kind of pulsing now. And let's just see how many we can do, right? To kind of like test the maximum speed of the system. It's hard to even find the mouse cursor in this mess. But let me see here. So I've been holding it down for quite some time, and it's still letting me move around pretty quickly. I mean, I can draw a lot of guys, but I can kind of tell by looking at the mouse cursor that it's pulsing a little bit slower now. And these guys aren't going to go away ever. You can just keep adding them and adding them and adding them, and they're just going to be there. Yeah, you can do a lot of things in C++ that would be difficult to do in other languages, and this is one example of that. So So that's how you can make a processor do a little bit of animation and have a little bit of behavior. And while this is not a game, it does give you an idea of what's possible. Thanks again for listening. Please sponsor the project if you like it. Subscribe, hit the bell if you need these videos to come into your mailbox. And we always appreciate at least a star and a watch on GitHub. That helps us on GitHub become more, or allow people to find us easier.